Have you ever just found yourself to be stuck? Like you just feel hopeless and helpless and you see no way out of your situation? Well, this video is all about this. We have all been in this situation. We've all been stuck. We've all felt hopeless. The key takeaway here is that the mindset that got you into being hopeless and stuck is not the mindset that's going to get you out. All right, so get ready. This video is going to be a deep dive into psychology. I'm actually really excited. We're going to learn kind of the science behind hopelessness. We're going to find out some psychological techniques that you can use to get yourself unstuck. And we're gonna find out why you're stuck in the first place. Like, why would your brain do this? What's the kind of evolutionary purpose of being stuck? So the stuck feeling has many different names in psychology. It's external locus of control. It's lack of autonomy. It's lack of self-efficacy. There's all kinds of different ways that we study this. One of the most interesting, though, is learned helplessness. This term, learned helplessness, was coined by Marty Seligman in the 60s. And he actually is the father of positive psychology, but a lot of people don't know is that he started out his career with this set of experiments on learned helplessness. And you ask, what is learned helplessness? Well, so Marty Seligman found this concept when he did a set of experiments on dogs in the 60s. So please note that we don't do experiments like this anymore. They are considered unethical, and I do not condone any type of experimentation on animals. With that caveat, I think the experiments and the science are important to know because it can really help us understand this concept. So what happened is that Marty Seligman did one of those Pavlovian conditioning experiments. I'm sure some of you might remember this from Psych 101, in which we know stimulus, response, etc. What Marty did is that he conducted small shocks onto these dogs in a cage. And so the dogs would get random small shocks while they were stuck in their cage. There was no way to escape. These dogs with the shocks are one group in the experiment. As you know, there's always a control group in most experiments. The control group in this experiment was a set of dogs that did not receive any shocks. They were just in their cage, just kind of happily hanging out. So in the second part of the experiment, what Marty did is he created a special cage in which you could actually jump over a barrier in the cage to escape. So it wasn't really a cage, it just kind of looked like one to the dogs. And what he did was he put the first set of dogs in these cages that you could escape from, the dogs that had gotten shocks. And these dogs, when they received shocks in these new cages that were escapable, they just lay down and sat there and they did not escape. What's interesting is that the dogs that had not previously received shocks, the control group, they went ahead and escaped. They received a shock and they were out of there. They weren't going to put up with those shocks. So this is learned helplessness. Essentially, we learn to be helpless. So if we are faced with situations in which we do not have any control over them, if they're random, if we just feel like we have no agency, we often start to feel like we just don't have any agency on anything. Essentially, learned helplessness is trained into us by continually encountering situations in which we do not have any control. Over time, we assume that we don't have control in even any new situation, and we just kind of stop trying, just like the dogs in this experiment. So this concept of learned helplessness really coincides with the concept of the brain as a prediction machine. So this is kind of a concept that's popular right now in neuroscience. And it basically says that if every time we try to have an impact in our lives and we fail, then the brain will predict failure. This is hopelessness. This is helplessness. This is that feeling. And this helplessness schema, which is like another word for mindset, is that your brain views the world through this schema, and it is formed through past experience and also through new information that you are feeding your brain. So in its predictions, the brain is trying to protect you. Okay, so now you might be thinking, how does learned helplessness relate to work? Like, how does it relate to my job? So what happens is that in large organizations, I'm not going to name any names, we know that there's not a lot of self-efficacy that happens. So our workers do not feel a lot of autonomy. They are kind of workers in this large system. And I want to illustrate this concept with an example because it's kind of hard to wrap your brain around. Let's imagine you are an employee at a large company. So large corporations are often breeding grounds for learned helplessness due to the fact that in an organization of like such a massive scale, it's difficult to determine cause and effect. An employee might think that working extra hours might garner him or her a promotion, but in fact, his project gets cut. And so there's very little agency in these types of situations. And just the fact that the scale is so large, individual contributions, individual hopes, individual actions don't have very clear cause and effect. It's a large organization, it's a system, and it's very intertwined. So sometimes people can start to feel hopeless because their small contribution, their small change isn't seen very clearly. So again, let's go back to our example. And I actually received this as a question. So imagine with me as you will. You are an employee at a large organization. You feel overwhelmed by the problems assigned to you and your workload, but you feel like you just can't ask for help. You know that asking for help would elicit favorable outcomes. It would make maybe your job easier, the problems would be solved faster, you might even learn more. But you just feel like you can't seem to turn to your colleagues or supervisors for help. This leads you to feel hopeless and disparaged by your work. You feel like you've exhausted your knowledge and skills in trying to solve the problem, and you know that your colleagues can help, yet you can't get yourself to ask for help. You're stuck. So why would you do this? Why would you stand in your way of getting help? Well, to put it really simply, your brain is trying to protect you. Contrary to popular notions, your brain actually has really, really good reasons for doing things. In this case, your brain is having to choose between allowing you to feel hopeless or allowing your autonomy to be threatened. So what is autonomy? Autonomy is one of your 3 basic psychological needs as presented by self-determination theory. The other are relatedness, which is your ability to connect with others, and competence, which is your ability to feel skilled. And autonomy is your ability to feel like you have agency and freedom in your life. As you can imagine, autonomy is sometimes difficult to achieve in a large corporation. The individual in our example is holding on to their autonomy. Asking for help would jeopardize that autonomy, and their brain perceives their autonomy as in lack, as in deficit. So your brain is actually trying to protect you in this case, in our example, in which if you were to let go of this autonomy, you would essentially be at a depletion for this basic psychological need. So what do you do in this situation? Because you're having to choose between lack of autonomy and hopelessness. So if we're thinking of our brain as an information processing machine, we know that our focus is the data that we're feeding into this machine. So as we go through our day, we all have stories we weave about the world in our brains. And some stories we give greater focus and some stories we just dismiss. Although these stories seem real, they are not. They're predictions and simulations of a brain that's not always right. Our brain can really only work as well as the information we feed it, just like a statistical model is only as good as its data. In our example, our individual is focusing on his lack of resources and his lack of autonomy. In order to have the capacity to ask for help in a way that doesn't threaten his autonomy, he needs to create a sense of safety for himself in his brain. So you can think of this as your brain is building a case, like a detective, and you must feed it better clues. So what do? You need to start looking for clues of autonomy. What are the moments you feel like you had agency in the world? What would you like to do that matters? Where do you have freedom? What do you get pride out of? Where do you feel joy? Take these moments and soak them in. Have your thoughts return to these moments. Start building the story of a person who has impact. feed your brain with better data. So if you remember from our last video, your brain is like Teflon for positive emotions and like Velcro for negative emotions. Negative emotions are just naturally more sticky in our brains, and we need to kind of fight against that. So if you are stuck, there's the possibility that you're asking the wrong question. So if you were, say, Googling something on Google and you actually put in like a really strange query, you wouldn't get any results. Like if it didn't make sense, you just would get nothing. It would show you nothing in the results. When you are hopeless and you are consistently asking your brain the wrong question, in most cases, it is because you're asking your brain to stop being hopeless and stuck. Your brain does not have an answer for that. It's a really negative way of addressing psychology, which we can all blame on Freud and colleagues. But this way of thinking is not as effective as a solution-focused approach, which actually can give us better, more creative answers and solutions to our situation of being stuck. So we need to start asking our brain, when do I feel accomplished? And when do I feel free? When do I feel like I have agency? When do I feel joy? Find these moments and expand them in your mind. Think about them, soak them in. Then your brain will start working for you to create more of these moments. The positive emotions that focusing on these thoughts fosters will also help you get unstuck by creating more creative solutions, as well as being more resilient to stress. Going back to our example, as our individual fills his need for autonomy by recognizing the moments of autonomy in his day and trying to expand on them, he will find ways to generate more moments of autonomy. His brain will perceive his need for autonomy to not be in danger. And then he might be able to engage in solutions like asking people for help and not feel like it's a detriment to his identity. I'd also like to add that we live and work in environments that are some of the most complex and ambiguous in our history. These environments are not necessarily conducive to meeting psychological needs such as autonomy. And if you feel that you are hopeless or helpless or you're stuck, remember that a feeling like hopelessness does not mean that you are a hopeless person. We often confuse feelings with personality traits, and this is not the case. So remember, you are not hopeless. You are living in an environment that is facilitating feelings of hopelessness because we live in a society that is not necessarily conducive to mental health. So we need to work a little bit extra hard with our brains doing some of these types of techniques to undo some of these detriments that we have in our culture. All right, guys, I hope you find this useful. If you have a question that you want to submit, feel free to comment below or send it to me on any of the social networks. I always keep them anonymous, and I will see you guys next week.